Welcome back to Odd Socks. So I've brought you in to our tomato tunnel. So we built this polytunnel a little while ago using the pallet and the recycled resources way, and it has done us really well for the last couple of years. Now I haven't really brought you much into this year, and it's not because of any failed crops, it's just because I've had so much other stuff to actually do. But I thought today we would have a look at some of our tomatoes. Now, over the past few weeks or so, we've been harvesting tomatoes as we've been going along. Some of our beefsteak tomatoes have been getting absolutely massive, and we've had some real whoppers this year. Now at first I actually thought that this polytunnel wasn't as good this year with our tomatoes as it was last year, but we have tried a fair few different varieties. Now some of these varieties have done really well this year and some have performed quite poorly, and I'm going to put a list up here of all the different types of tomatoes that we're growing, because we've actually planted 28 different varieties here in this polytunnel this year. Now, as I go through some of these tomatoes, I'll try and remember the number or the name, or I'll try and put it up on the top corner for you to see what the varieties are. Now, I don't think the growth has been as fantastic this year as in last year for this polytunnel or previous years when we've grown tomatoes, but they're doing okay. Now, I've got to remember that we're just at the beginning of August and I was still harvesting tomatoes. I think it was into October last year, and I think in a previous video I did last year with the tomato polytunnel, that's when I was actually clearing it out and still collecting an awful lot of tomatoes. So we have still got an awful lot of time. Now as you can see, there's a lot that is actually growing really tall. Now we do remove some of the lower branches as we're going along, but we don't do it to the extreme length, never have done. And we probably never will either. We've found that we don't need to do that. We still get an abundant, massive harvest. I think this year, with the lack of light that we've had for majority of the growing season, I think it has had a bit of an effect on things like the tomatoes. Even though we will actually get a good crop off of these, we are coming into a few little issues. Now, as you can see here, this brown stem. Now my first thought when I first saw it was, oh my God, we've actually got blight on the inside of our polytunnel, which is not something we get until much later on in the year. And I was really starting to panic, but then I realised none of my outdoor tomatoes had any blight spores or any issues with blight at all so far this year. Since blight is windborne, I kind of rethought about what it could be, because if it's windborne, it would definitely come and get my outdoor tomatoes first before even getting into the polytunnel. And if it was blight, it was incredibly lucky to land on a plant and not outside inside my polytunnel. So what we noticed, it's on areas where we've actually trimmed back our tomato plants. This started to develop. Now, after doing a bit more reading, because it's not something we've had before, we found out that it's most likely grey mould, often called this too. Now, it can still cause major issues with your tomatoes, especially if it gets really bad, because it can hollow the stem and make the actual plant fall over and rot away in that area. Now, we had it, I think, on 4 or 5 different plants, and certain varieties seem to be a little bit more susceptible than others, at least. But there was always that worry about blight. Now this actually started about 3 weeks or so, and if this was blight, the whole of this polytunnel would have turned by now, which can be quite devastating for a tomato crop. But I think we may have averted a lot of damage. It's really important that you clean your secateurs or scissors or whatever it is that you're using when you're cutting back your tomatoes, because you can easily spread these spores onto other plants. Now this particular plant is still producing and it seems to be okay. And it does seem to be drying up a little bit as well. But we'll keep an eye on it and see how it goes. Now, this year, because we're doing kind of an experiment to find some really good tomatoes, next year we're not actually going to be sowing or planting so many tomatoes or varieties. But this, called Flame, is definitely one that we're going to be doing again this year. Now, we have had probably about 15 off our Flame plants. Now, I think we've got about 4 plants of Flame. And these get very, very big. Now, they're not the biggest tomato that you can grow in your polytunnels, but it is absolutely beautiful on the inside. The flesh is unbelievably tasty, hardly any seeds, and it is flamed throughout. So you get those little red streaks all the way through your tomatoes. And it is a fantastic tomato to have with your salads. So our Flame is definitely one we are going to be sowing and growing for next year. I think as well I'll probably can with some of these because they have been quite prolific and we have still got flowers producing on here. So hopefully we'll carry on getting more of a crop. But Flame is definitely really, really tasty. And I'm really happy with these ones this year. Now another larger variety that we've got is called Knockout. Now we've never grown these ones before. This is a first. But they're producing really good sized tomatoes. Not quite ripe yet. Another day or two and they will be ready. Now it's not the most biggest of plants, and in fact it's a lot shorter than some of the others, but it's growing really well and it is now producing a lot more tomatoes as we go further up the plant, and it's even still flowering. Now we've also got this plum called Pyramid. Now I've never grown this one before, but to be honest, these tomatoes are actually quite tasty and we've had 1 or 2 for a salad. Now, I wanted to grow some plums because they are great for canning and making your own sauces. It's a reasonable size and it seems to have started to fruit quite prolifically now. And I'm really hoping for a good crop of these. Now this is our Big Mama. Now we've grown this for several years and absolutely love the taste of these plum tomatoes. They get nice and big, so they are perfect to make your own pasta sauces. Not very many seeds, and they are extremely juicy. Now this Big Mama is definitely something that will be growing again for the next few years at least, because we always get a half decent crop. Now this is not the biggest we've had off of this. In fact, we've been harvesting off this Big Mama for the last 3 to 4 weeks. Now this is our other plum, our Roma. Now we've been growing Roma for years off and on, and I really wanted to grow several different varieties of plum tomatoes to be used in cooking, because there's only so many fresh tomatoes that you can eat. Now we thought we would try Sindel this year. And I think we may have done it in the past as well. And it is quite prolific with its fruiting. Not as heavy, but we have taken off quite a few of these tomatoes. But it is still producing, which is great. But unfortunately, the tomatoes taste very, very similar to what you would get in the supermarket. Now that's not the kind of tomato I'm after. Even though it's still cheaper, I want something that tastes a lot better than what you get in the supermarket. So this is a variety I don't think we'll be growing again for next year. Now the one we wanted to try was our Gigantimo. But really, they aren't that gigantic. And in fact, some of our other varieties are much, much bigger. And as you can see, the flower trusses are starting to die. Now, this is either lack of pollination or some other issue that's happening on our tomato plant. But as you can see, they're just dying back. Now, it's not a watering issue. These get regular water and they get regular feed. But just on this one plant, all the flowers just keep dying. So we're really not going to be getting many more tomatoes off of this particular plant. So I think for next year, this is probably not going to be on our list. And these ones are definitely taking a lot longer to ripen than some of our other tomatoes. Now this is our cherokee purple. Now I think we grew this last year and it was actually quite tasty. Now they are taking their time, but we have had a little bit of a crop already off of these and they were extremely tasty. But we really will have to see how this develops because they are very slow when it comes to ripening. And again, in fact, I can see some of these flowers have actually failed to pollinate and are struggling. So it's definitely something I need to keep an eye on. But there is still plenty of flowers on there to develop, so I'm not too worried with this particular plant. Now another one that is doing really well, and it is one of my favourites, is burlesque. This is a very tasty tomato and it really is starting to produce more fruit. Now I think this year our trusses aren't as full as previous years, but we will still get lots of tasty tomatoes off this plant, and it is still starting to flower, so there is still time to grow and ripen these tomatoes. But they are definitely one to grow again for next year. Now one we're going to grow next year is our vivacious. This has been a really, really tasty tomato. Now it's a slight small plum. Well, it's supposed to be a large plum variety, but we haven't found it to be that big a plum. But it is doing very well, and we have got 3 plants of these. So again, the plums for our cooking will definitely come in handy over the next few weeks as I'm starting to can my tomato sauces. Now, has it been our best tomato year? Definitely not. Last year we managed to fill several of those crates over the seasons with lots and lots of tomatoes. In fact, I think overall it would have been about 7 or 8 crates of tomatoes that we had last year from this polytunnel. Now, Jamie has overplanted this area a little bit, but we have made sure that there is plenty of feed. But I honestly think this growing season has just been a little bit more difficult. And I think the way the weather's been, the cooler temperatures at the beginning, making the tomatoes a little bit more unhappy, especially through the overnight temperatures. Some years are just better than others. Even though we are still getting fantastic crops off of this and we're getting regular tomatoes, it just isn't quite the same as last year. But I still should have enough crops, fingers crossed that we don't get any blight or any other issues that's going to stop too much of the fruiting. We should have enough tomatoes to fully stock us for tomato sauces and passatas, soups and other things through the rest of next year at least. Well, that's what I'm hoping, because that's what we use majority of our tomatoes for. Some of the earlier ones we use for fresh eating throughout the day, for sandwiches or salads or whatever it is, salsas, things like that. And the rest we use to make sauces or chili sauces or whatever it is to help us throughout the rest of the year. So that is our tomato tunnel this year. It's not the most amazing, but it also could be an awful lot worse. Now, our outdoor tomatoes are actually doing really well. Now, there's loads and loads and loads of green tomatoes on our outdoor tomato plants, and we've only picked probably 2 or 3 ones that have been ripe. Now, we're growing in 2 different areas, one directly outside this polytunnel and one by our other polytunnel, which we have it in a line. And these ones outside our tomato polytunnel, they have actually got quite a lot of fruit on. Now, they're not going to be as big as the ones in our polytunnel. The weather has been definitely much cooler especially at the start of the year, than what it has been in the polytunnel. And these are out in all different weather conditions. But they're growing and they seem quite chunky. So they should, in theory, produce some ripe fruit quite soon, so long as the weather really does hold out. Now these are our other outdoor tomatoes, and again we are not going to get prolific fruits on these outdoor tomatoes. It really just has not been the year for it. But we are getting fruits and they are starting to ripen. But these of course are not going to be anywhere near as big as our polytunnel ones. But fingers crossed, we can hold back any local blight and we may actually get a half decent crop this year. So how's your tomatoes going? Are they doing okay or are they struggling this year? Like I said, I think I would like to have had a better year with our tomatoes, but I think how this year's been in general with growing, I think we're lucky to have any tomatoes whatsoever. We have definitely weeded out the ones that we won't be growing next year for one reason or another. They've either been very weak or the fruits haven't been that great. And the ones that we're going to focus more on for next year. Now it's kind of a little bit unfair because of how our growing conditions have been this year, but we are going to focus on the ones that we definitely know we enjoy. So that's it for today, guys. Thank you for joining me on my tomato journey, and I shall see you in the next video.